So today we're going to continue with exercise 125, and as I said last class, we're going to go through each of the pieces of your assignment 106 on consecutive days. So today we're going to do the elevation, next class we'll do the plan, then we're going to take a break and work on portfolios, then we'll come back and do what's left? The section and the perspective. So we're going to do all four of those. I realize that a lot of you haven't finished modeling your cabin yet, so you can keep working on that a bit today, but I want to walk through this process because we just don't have enough days left in the semester. If it was possible for me to give you a working day, I would love to do that, but we just don't have the time. So I have to forge ahead anyway, even if you end up taking it as a working day. So as we start to kind of think through this here, we're going to want to create an elevation view of our model. And so as part of assignment 106, you're only required to do one of the four elevations. So it's just one elevation. So when you start thinking about your model and you're building that 3D model, one side needs to be complete. The other sides might not need to be as complete. And I think that's one thing that people lose track of, certainly in this class, but also in other design studios that you might be taking. Frequently, you don't have to finish the whole building. You need to show what is finished in your models and in your drawings, etc. So let's say you're in 220 and you're working on your project. You don't necessarily have to model the interiors of the bathrooms because nobody's going to see it. You're never going to do that rendering. So think about what it is that you're showing and make sure that that's the part that's done and well detailed and well documented. So in my scenario, I pulled up the model that I was working on last class, and if I flip it around to the back side, guess what? There's nothing there, because that's not the elevation view that I'm going to show. I'm going to show this front elevation view. So what we're going to work on today is getting this view into its elevation format and then exporting it and working on some collage in Photoshop to make it look a little bit better than just your standard SketchUp export. So as I start to set up the elevation view, I want to point out a few things. One, when I get my building into what appears to be an elevation view, like this, as I look at it, it's still not a true elevation because it's in one-point perspective. So if I look at these edges of my building, they're going to a vanishing point, say right here. These lower edges are still going back to a vanishing point. So this is not a true elevation. It's still a perspective. And so we need to make sure that we switch into a true elevation. So I'm going to go up to the camera menu. Sorry, it's the view. No, it's the camera menu. And I'm going to go to standard views and I'm going to look at the front view. Oops, sorry, I'm going to look at the back view. So I'm going to go to my standard views and I'm going to look at the back view. And when I look at the back view, it's still not quite right. But if I go back up to camera and instead of having perspective checked, I go back to parallel projection, which is the one on top, it's going to switch into a flat elevation view for me. I can choose to pan my model. I can use this little hand to move the model over so that it's roughly centered. Furthermore, I could zoom in a little bit so that it's filling the bulk of my screen, right about like that or so. But before I do any exports to this, I want to make sure that I can come back to this exact view when I change something later on. So if I move my model and I add something to it, I want to be able to come back to this exact view and then just slip that new building into my Photoshop collage. So what you're doing today, even if you update it, frequently you can just put in some new base layers on your Photoshop file and it'll still work. So I'm going to save that, and SketchUp does that by saving something called a scene. So over here in my default tray, if I come down to the scenes section here and I open that up, you see I actually have a bunch of scenes that I've done before, but I'm going to go ahead and click the plus icon to create a brand new scene. And it's currently called Scene 5. I'm going to rename this. Let me zoom. Let's see here. Let me rename the scene. Here we go. And we'll call this Elevation. And for my own clarity, I'm going to say it's fall of 2019. And there it is. So the advantage to this is that if I were to start moving it around, etc., I can always come back to that elevation view that's exactly the same every time. So now that my elevation view is set up, I'm going to go ahead and work with the styles tray over here. And I already have it open, but I'm going to look for styles, and I'll expand that styles tray. And I'm going to start by picking a style called Hidden Line. It's available under the default styles drop down here. And depending on how wide your tray is, it's about 5 over on the top row. And I'll click on that Hidden Line style. And when I click on Hidden Line style, you see that I've lost the color of the background, I've lost the color of the glass, etc. It's essentially, by doing that, I'm saying just give me a plain black and white line drawing of my model. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and refine it a little bit more. I'm going to go up to the View menu, and I'm going to uncheck Guides so that my guides go away. I'm going to go to the View menu and uncheck Axes so that my axes are going to go away. I'll uncheck Section Fill. I'll uncheck Section Cuts. And now I'm down to essentially a perfectly plain line drawing. Nothing fancy about it whatsoever. Once I have this plain line drawing set up, I need to go ahead and export that plain line drawing. This, by the way, I should have pointed out, this is available, what I'm doing here. If you go to the course website and you go to Tutorials and then SketchUp, this SketchUp 4.4 Styles for Photoshop will do exactly what I'm doing. It walks you through how to do it. The image files are in perspective, but the concept is exactly the same. Normally, I would have gone through this in exercise 123, but we didn't get to do that this semester. So I have this as a plain set of lines. I'm going to go to the File menu, and I'm going to choose Export 2D Graphic. So I go to File, Export 2D Graphic. And when I do that, it's going to ask me first to save this. So let's go to my flash drive here. Fall of 2019. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder for elevation. And we will call this elevation. And I'm going to add an underscore and then just plain lines. So it's elevation 1 and then underscore lines, so that I know this is the line version of it. But before I click export, I'm going to click on the options button here. And when I click on that option buttons, we're going to look first at the image size. And you see right now, the width and the height, it's 1600 pixels by 900 pixels or so. This is not particularly large in its size. If I want this drawing to print out on a larger piece of paper, if I want to be able to blow it up, I need more resolution during this export. Generally, it's safe to think of about 300 pixels per inch if you're printing. So if you wanted this elevation to be 10 inches, it would be about 3,000 pixels. Does that kind of make sense for doing the math? So if you wanted it to be 20 inches, you'd have 6,000 pixels. So you judge your drawing accordingly. So I'm going to say somewhere in about 5,000 pixels. Now, it won't let me change it because this check mark says use view size. I'm going to uncheck that, and then I can go ahead and put in 5,000 pixels. It automatically adjusts the height for me. And under JPEG compression here, we want to make sure it's on the best quality. And then I can say OK. So with that done, I'll go ahead and click on Export. And it will make my first line drawing export that'll end up being in Photoshop. So as I go through, I have several other styles that may or may not be relevant. I'm going to go through and create them out of practice and out of habit so that you see all of the process here. Sometimes it makes a difference. Sometimes what I do ends up not making much of a difference. And so it'll vary a little bit depending on your export. So the next one is to go ahead and change so that we're seeing hidden lines behind this front facade. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the Edit. So I'm still in the Styles menu here. I'm going to click on the Edit tab instead. And I'm going to click on, I feel like I'm missing a piece of this here. No, apparently not. There we go. I'm going to move over from my edge settings into my face settings, and I'm going to click on this X-ray button here. And so in my scenario, it doesn't add too much. But depending on your model, you may get a little bit more. You may get depth. You may get something that's showing behind something else. So it's always worth it to turn those on, and then you'll do another export. So I'll go to File, and then Export 2D Graphic. And so I had Elevation 1 lines. The next one here is going to be Elevation 1 X-ray. Now if I click on Options, all the options are exactly the same as they were before. So I can go ahead and say OK, and then Export. And I think it's possible that I ended up adjusting, because I changed this side panel, I might have changed the export. So let me really quickly go back and re-export this. Let me go to Hidden Lines. I'm going to turn off my section cuts, section fill, axes, and guides. There we go. I'll go to File and then Export 2D Graphic. Oh, that's fine. Perfect. Export. The reason that it matters so much on these exports that they're the same is we're going to stack them up in Photoshop. And if they're different sizes or they move, it's much harder to stack them up. We want them to be identical in their size. So I'll turn on X-ray again, do the same export, 2D Graphic. There's X-ray, and we'll go ahead and export that one as well. All right, so now that one's done. Now, in some cases, and I've turned back off the X-ray, you have a bunch of guides. And so if you turn on the guides, they may be useful to kind of giving background texture to what you're doing. In my case, the guides do absolutely nothing. They're not helping me here, so I'm not going to bother with the export. So I'll go ahead and go back to turn off my guides. The next one, though, is shadows. So if I go to the View menu and then I check the box for shadows, I'm going to see shadows on the face of my building. Now, to adjust the shadows so that they're a little bit more interesting, right now I get just blank. It's all in shadow. I'm going to open up the shadows tray on the right side, and then I'll adjust the time of day and the time of year in the hope that I will start to get some more interesting shadows. So I'm using these sliders to try to adjust. And of course, it's doing such a good job of not letting me. There we go. So I'm working to try to get something with a little bit more interest. This is a hard facade because it's on the north side of the building, so you don't get too much shadow on that. It depends on which facade you're doing. But here we go. Now I've set it up so that at least I get a little diagonal there, and I can see where the building is in shadow and where it's not. So to do the export, I could just export it like this, but I have all the lines, and I'm re-exporting all the lines. So I'm going to go ahead and go in and turn the lines off. So once again, I'll go back to my Edit tab in the Styles tray. And with the Edit tab, I'm going to go back to the Edge settings instead of the Face settings. And I'll uncheck Edges. And when I do that, I'm going to end up seeing just the shadows. So the lines go away. I have just the shadows. Then I'll go ahead and do another export. So I have just the shadows. We'll go to File, Export 2D Graphic. And we'll call this one Shadows. Perfect. And then we'll export. Same settings still apply. Perfect. So now I have the shadows done. Those are the primaries that I need to export. You can choose to export other styles that may or may not enhance your drawing. I'll show you a few as we go forward, but these would be the essentials that you have to have. As we go forward, we might want to explore some of the artistic styles and export the artistic styles. So I'll come over here into Default Styles. I'm going to go to the Sketchy Edges instead of Default. And with Sketchy Edges, I've found some success with the airbrush with endpoints, which does not look so good here, but when you actually export it, it ends up looking pretty good. So that's from experience. I'm going to go back up to View, make sure my section fill, section cuts, and section planes are off. I'm also going to turn off my shadows and my guides. And then right here, I'll go ahead and do this export. So I'll go to File, and then Export 2D Graphic. And I will call this one Airbrush. and then we'll go ahead and export that. And the other style that I've had some success with is one called the marker, what is it, pen gray. I have to find it, pen gray right there. You could also do pen black. It adds a little bit of casual flair to the drawing. So I'll go ahead, I'm going to do pen black so it's a little bit darker, and I'm going to turn off, once again, all of these same things. So guides will turn off, section fill, section cuts, section planes, all off. And then I'll go ahead and export this one. So I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic, and we'll call this one Pen. And then Export. You could also choose to export something with some color on it, something like this. Sometimes it's useful because you can do a color select in Photoshop. Like I could color select all of the windows because they're all one shade of blue. It's usually not useful in the final product, but sometimes it can help with selections. So we'll do one of these as well, so you can see that. I'll turn off all of the same things. There we go. Then I'll do an export. I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic, and we can call this one Color. And I'll go ahead and click on Export. So I've done all of my SketchUp exports, and it's now time to jump over into Photoshop. So here I am in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and open up that first drawing that I created, the lines drawing. I'll go to File and then Open. Then I have to go to my flash drive and open up the first elevation, which was the lines elevation, this one. I'll go ahead and click on Open. And it will open up. It's probably a little bit difficult to see on the projector right now because they're not all layered up just yet. But I'll have that one as the first one. Then I'll go to File and then Place Embedded to bring in the next one. So I did the lines. Next one will be the elevation, or excuse me, the X-ray. And I'll bring that one in as well. So I have my first one here is my lines. Next one is X-ray. Then we'll go to File and then Place Embedded. You can see where this is going. What did we do after X-ray? We did the shadows. I confirm. File, Place, Embedded. Next one was Airbrush. Confirm. File, Place, Embedded. The pen, File, Place, Embedded, and Color was my last one there. So by controlling the export, all of these line up on top of each other, which makes my life a little bit easier. So let's organize the layers. I like to rename the layers so that they're nice and clear. So we'll start with this first one and call it Color. This one is called Pen. This one here is called Airbrush. Shadow. X-ray. And this background layer was my original lines. So I'll right-click on the background layer and say Layer from Background to unlock it. And this one will be my lines layer right there. So I currently am only seeing the topmost layers because I haven't changed the blending modes on any of these yet. Let me turn off Color, and then I'll start with Pen here, and I'm going to change the blending mode. We did this before earlier in the semester. I'm going to change from Normal to Multiply, which is going to cause the white in this layer to become transparent. I'll do that for all of the layers. So I'll go through here and switch each one to Multiply. And as I go through and switch those to Multiply, you'll see the line drawing start to emerge as a little bit darker. The only one that I won't change to Multiply is the original lines layer. So you can see how this essentially builds up from the lines, one after the next, to start to build into that little bit darker elevation view. So that by itself is better than anything you could get out of SketchUp, just by layering those up and having a little bit more control over your lines. But we're going to try to take this a little bit further in the collage process. So the first thing that we need to kind of work through is, what about the ground? So remember, in an elevation view, we're taking a plane that's directly in front of the building, and we're cutting it right there. So generally in an elevation view, the ground would be filled in as solid. So I could use my color to help me make a selection. I could use color, and then I could use the magic wand tool to select the ground, or the bottom here. It's interesting. Oh, sorry, I have to be on the color layer. There we go. And that would help me select where the ground would be. I'll turn back off the color, and then I want to create a new layer for the ground. So let me click on New Layer. I want it to be on the very top of the layer stack, which it currently is, and I will rename that to be Ground. On that layer, I'm going to fill in this ground with black. So I already have black as my foreground color. I'll come up to my brush tool. This is my regular paintbrush tool. I need to adjust my size so that it's a little bit bigger. Makes my life easier to fill it in. And then we'll go ahead and paint in the ground. So I now have the ground as part of the elevation. So you can already tell that the building feels like it's resting on something. It's not just floating there anymore, which is a good thing. But the ground is perfectly flat, and ground is never perfectly flat. So I need to spend a little bit of time and adjust that ground a bit so that it has a slope. Now in this case, I didn't do anything with the slope from my building. I know that it sloped a little bit in one direction, but I'm not going to worry about it too much for this purpose. I'm going to go ahead and just use this lasso tool here, and I'm going to draw right along the top, just with some ups and some downs. Like that, and then I'll swoop back around and connect to where I started, and that makes this selection. I can then come in with my paintbrush tool again, and I'm still on the ground layer, and I can paint those places where I went up and down, like that. So if I were to zoom in on this, that ground is no longer flat. It's moving up, it's moving down, which is a little bit more realistic. So the other thing that can really help and enhance this is to add a little bit of a grass texture along there, because this would be sitting in some kind of a natural setting. If you were in a city setting where you had a sharp sidewalk or a curb, you probably wouldn't have even varied the ground. It would stay sharp. It's going to be dependent on your building. But we're in Yosemite, so having some grass probably would be a good idea. So I'm going to use my clone stamp tool, which is the little rubber stamp looking tool, and I'm going to switch my brush into that grass brush. Remember, that was a little bit challenging because we had to load it because it's called a legacy brush. I'm going to click on the little gear icon in my brush palette here and choose legacy brushes. And I want to restore that list. There's my legacy brushes. I'm going to be under the default brushes, and it's about halfway down. There it is, grass. I'm going to click on the grass brush. Once I have that selected, I may need to do some bracket adjustment here to see the size. Let me hold down Alt to copy from the black. It's here. And that's a little bit too big. Let's make that a little bit smaller. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and fill in right along the bottom surface here. I may have to adjust where I'm copying from as I get closer to the edge so that I can go right off the edge. I'll use spacebar to pan over, and then I'll keep copying. And building up that grass. I'm not varying the size of the brush at all because this is all on one plane. So it's all the same distance from the camera. So I'll finish that up right about like that. If I press Control-0, we can zoom out and we can now see, whoop, looks like I missed just a little bit along that edge. There we go. And we can see that I now have a nice ground that's been established for the bottom of my elevation view. So it's pretty good. It's a nice line drawing. I've got a nice ground to work with. We can continue to add to it, though, and we could say find a collage image for the background. And so as I go through these various options, you're going to have to learn to edit what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, how much collage do you do, how little collage do you do, at what point does it look right. And that's going to vary based on the presentation and what you're trying to show, depending on going forward what your project is. So there's always a little bit of editing. So don't just blindly do everything that I do. I'm just trying to show you all of the things that you can do, and then you pick which ones look the best. So let's think about bringing in a background image. So if I was going to bring in a background image, first thing I need to do is find a background image. I could use the Creative Commons search to find one. I could also use Google Image Search. If you're using Google Image Search, though, make sure you go into your tools and in the not filtered by license, that's what it'll say initially, change that to labeled for non-commercial reuse with modification. You're not selling it, so it's non-commercial reuse, and you're allowed to modify it. It just protects your rights a little bit as you go forward. And so as we look at this, I typed in Yosemite Meadow. That seemed like a good search term to find a decent background image. You'll find a variety of images. Ideally, we're looking for an image that's large enough so that we're not going to get blurry results in the background. Like this one's nice, but it's only 1280 by 847 pixels. So that's not really big enough. So I'd rather find something that's a little bit bigger. Here's one that looks pretty nice, 4,320 by 2,280, or 2,880. That seems pretty reasonable. So I'll click on that. Yeah, I think I could use that one. And we could go ahead and go to the website itself. There it is. Download. And let's see, we want full resolution. I'll right click and save image as, and I'll put this into my folder for today. There we go, and I can go ahead and I can save it. Sometimes finding the background image is the most challenging part. Sometimes it just takes a while to keep looking through images. Some will end up working better than others. Sometimes they have things in the way. In this case, it would probably be okay with those people because they'd be covered up. But you'd want to keep looking, and eventually you'll find an option that looks pretty reasonable. Okay, so I'm going to minimize that. And now I need to bring in that particular image. Now, chances are there's going to be more image than what I'm currently seeing here. So I may need to adjust the size of my canvas or my workspace, kind of like the artboard in Illustrator. And I can do that by going up to Image and then Canvas Size. And if I'm going to make the canvas size bigger, I have to think about which direction I want to make it bigger. So currently, if I were to change the width and the height, it would be making it bigger in all directions at once. If I change my anchor point to be at the bottom middle, it's going to make it taller and wider. I'm not so worried about the wider, but I am worried about the taller. So I'll take the height and I'll go up to maybe 40. I can always crop it back down, so giving yourself a little extra space is not a bad thing. I'll go ahead and say OK, and you'll see that my size just got a lot bigger. At this point, I can bring in that background image. I'll go to File and then Place Embedded. I'll take my background image and I'll go ahead and I'll place it. I'm going to need to do some adjustments, so we need to make it big enough. I'm going to hold down Shift as I adjust. Oh, never mind. I don't have to hold down Shift anymore. It's constrained by default. And I'll make sure that my image is larger than my workspace, my canvas size. And I'll also change the layer so that it's below the ground layer. Now I can see the ground. And you can kind of intuitively tell that there's a place at which this feels like it belongs. If it's up here, it's too high. If it's down here, it's probably too low. So this is a gentle upslope, so I'd probably see just a little bit beyond. Maybe something like that. Feels about right. And notice that the grass kind of blends into the meadow, which is part of the strategy here. So the ground is on top. Then I have the background image. If I were to turn, and actually currently all of my building is still on, so I need to mask off this layer for my building. So let's go ahead and turn this off temporarily, and I want to look at my building, and it might even be easiest to look at it in the color version. I told you this is sometimes the easy thing to have in the background because I can use my magic wand tool to make some selections. So this is, oops, let me make sure I'm on the color layer. Here we go. That is clearly the background. Likewise, this is clearly the background. So even though my blue line stops there, I want to make sure I include both. And this is looking through my building. So that is open, so I want to make sure I include that. So I have those three pieces. I'll turn back on my meadow here, and I'll click on Add Layer Mask. Sorry. Like that. And now that cuts out my building, or my backdrop for my building. Does that kind of make sense, how I did that? So I masked off that piece. The advantage of doing it as a mask is if I went back to my original and I made a change because I didn't like something, I could very easily just swap in one of my new outputs in the same background. So we can just substitute it in later on. Let me turn off the color so we're not seeing that. There we go. And now we're seeing just the black and white line drawing against the background. It's possible that you may want to make some adjustments to the background, and we'll get to that. Maybe you turn it to black and white, maybe you turn it to a sepia tone, maybe you fade it out, etc. I'll look at that after I get a little bit further along in the process here. So the next thing might be to highlight the windows. We talked about highlighting the windows when we exported from AutoCAD. A lot of times by making the windows a color or making the windows a little bit of clouds, you can really accent what is glass and what is not glass. So we'll do that next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find an image of sky. Now, in this particular case, the sky is not very exciting. There's no clouds in the sky. If there were clouds in the sky, I'd want to kind of match the type of clouds that would be in the sky. But in this case, there really aren't any. So it's kind of hard to have something too cloudy, because if we were looking up the sky, it'd be weird to have the cloud, a bunch of clouds behind us and none in front of us. So I might look for something with some kind of wispy clouds or something really high. So let's try maybe like wispy clouds or wispy high clouds, something like that. Right, so just not too much. A little bit of texture, but not too much. Looks like the image size is not the best. Let's see here. Well, the original, it's probably okay because it's going to be a lot smaller than my, come on. There it is. It's downloading. There it is. Let me go ahead and copy this, and I'll put it over on my flash drive in my folder for today. There it is. We'll jump back into Photoshop, and then we'll paste that sky in. So we'll go to File and then Place Embedded. There's my sky. Place that one in. And I just want to make sure that it's big enough to cover up where all of my windows are, maybe something like that. I'll commit to the size. And just like we did before, I'll start with this color version. I'll use my magic wand tool, or alternatively, I could go to Select Color Range, because I could pick pretty easily the window. It looks like I have two different colors of windows, but it's pretty easy using the color range to pick all of the windows. Once I have that selected, I can go back to my cloud right here, and I can click on the Add Layer Mask, and it will cut out for all of those windows. So we'll turn back on the background, we'll turn off the color version, and now you can see that I have the windows filled in. Now maybe these windows are a little bit too blue in comparison to the background. Maybe I need to fade those out a little bit. Maybe I even need to do a levels call to the background. So we're always doing those kind of post-processing techniques as we go forward. So first thing I'll do is let me do a levels call to the background image. So I'll go up to my layer, new adjustment layer. We'll do a levels adjustment. There it is. And so on this levels adjustment, I might pinch in the darkness just a little bit. It's about like that. But I want it to apply only to the background. So when I want the layer on top to apply just to the layer below here, I'm going to press Control-Alt-G, and that's going to tie this layer only to the background layer. I can do the same thing with my windows. So let me go in to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and again I'm going to do a levels adjustment. Yeah, I think I'll do a levels adjustment. Control-Alt-G ties it just to the Windows layer, and then you can see that I can work on just those windows. I actually want to lighten those a bit. Maybe lighter like that. It's always hard because what you guys see on the screen is very different from what I see on my screen. So I'm trying to match up that blue with the blue of the sky. That's about right. Feels pretty good. So one of the challenges with Photoshop and when you're doing these kinds of collages is you can start to get a pretty messy layer stack. And there's a lot of layers in there, etc. You can start to create folders. Sometimes people like to do that where they take certain pieces. So let's say these two would be the windows, and you can create a folder or a group, and we could call that group windows. I could take this and this. I could make them a group and call that background image. So you can always just keep kind of refining your layers and creating those groups. It helps with organization just a little bit. Depends on how many layers you end up with. Okay, so I have those established. Now what about if I want to add in some actual textures on the building? Maybe I want to put a concrete texture on the building because it's going to be concrete. So in that case, I need to bring in, ideally, a tiling image. So I could go back to my image search. I could create a tiling image, or I could search for concrete texture tiling, maybe. Those are terrible results. Let's try Google. See if I can get a better result here. I probably already have some. Okay, that could work. Take a look at this particular one. Yeah, that'll work. I'm going to click on the, there's the download. Let's do the full size. I'll show it in its folder. There it is. I'm going to copy it and again put it in my flash drive. And we'll go ahead and paste that in. Perfect. And then we'll go back into Photoshop here, and I'll bring that texture in. So I'll go to File, and then Place Embedded. There it is, and we'll place it. Now one of the challenges here is making sure that it ends up being the right scale. So I need to have an understanding of how big these would be and make sure that those are small enough to match up with my building. So we'll make this a little bit smaller. Maybe smaller still. Maybe a little bit smaller, something like that. And then I'll go ahead and commit to it. There it is. Now, if it is in fact tiling, I should be able to take it. There it is. I should be able to draw a box around it. Doesn't have to be too precise. And then I can go to Edit, Copy, and then Edit, Paste. And I should get another version of it. There it is. And for clarity purposes, I'm actually going to turn off the windows so that you're not distracted by that, and you can see just the pattern here. And so each time I press Control-V, I can slide these together. To create the pattern all the way across my building. And luckily, Photoshop does a pretty good job of lining things up for us, so it can go pretty fast. All right, one more set here. All right, so I've tiled those together. Looks like this set doesn't quite match up perfectly. But anyway, you guys get the idea. So I've tiled all of that together. But in the process, I've made a mess of my layer stack here. So if I took this first one, which is right there, and I came up to wherever the last one of all these layers would be, right there at layer 26. If I hold down Shift and select the first one and the last one, I get all of them. I can then go up to my layer menu and say Merge Layers. These are the ones that are selected, and it will merge them all together into one layer. I can then rename that for concrete texture, like that. I'll turn back on my color version, and this time I need to select where I want that concrete texture to be applied. Oops, let me be on the color version here. And it might actually be easiest to do a color selection again, so I could go to Select, Color Range. Whoops, sorry. Let me deselect, then I'll go up to Select, Color Range, and I'm going to choose the white. Right about like that. I might have to turn off some of these other layers. So let me make sure the background image is off. Hold on a second. Let me make sure that background image is off. There we go. Now I can go to Select, Color Range, and select just the white. And then I could say OK. And then I could go ahead and on the concrete texture layer, I could create a layer mask for that concrete texture. This concrete texture probably needs to go further down in the layer stack though, so I'll drag it down so that it's just above the lines. It should be. Switch to multiply on it. And I need to turn off the color, and there it is. Now I can see that concrete texture through. Actually, I might not need to be multiplied. Let me go back to normal. So to me, it's appearing a little bit dark, especially in contrast to the background and the windows. So I might end up lightening up that concrete texture just a little bit. So right here, I could go on the concrete texture. I could go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I might do a Hue and Saturation adjustment. And then Control-Alt-G will tie the hue and saturation to the concrete texture, and then I might lighten up that concrete texture a little bit. So it's always about finding what the happy medium is. So at this point, I've done the texture for the background. I've done the sky texture. I have the background installed. I've got the ground. It's starting to look pretty good. I might want to spend a little bit of time and add, say, the frames of the windows. I currently have them set to be the concrete, but maybe I wanted to change those and make them wood. I don't think it's worth collaging in a wood texture. I think what I would do is I'd go into color here, and I go ahead and make my selections with the magic wand. Let's say there and there. And in the interest of time, I won't do all of the windows, but you guys get the idea. I could then create a new layer for window frames. And on that layer, I could paint using my paintbrush with kind of a nice brown color. Find a nice brown here. Yeah, maybe about like that. And then I could paint in, make sure I'm on the window layer here. And I could paint in for those frames that would go around the windows. Again, just an option, and it might enhance the look just a little bit of those particular pieces. Let me press Control-0. You can kind of see that makes the windows stand out just a little bit. So I might take a little time and do that for the rest of the pieces. So now at this point, the last thing that would be very, very helpful would be to have some kind of a idea of what the scale would be. And of course, you could put a graphic bar scale in here, but it's really hard when you do this collage work because we don't know how big everything's going to print. So the easiest way of adding a scale is to put a human figure in. And I would do just a silhouette because I think that's easier than putting a full collage person in here. You guys already created a bunch of silhouettes, so you should have them on your flash drive, or you could download them from online. I'll just go to File and then Place Embedded. And I should have some in my flash drive as well. There are my people. And let's pick this one right here. And I'll go ahead and click on place. I want that person to be all the way up on top of everything except for the ground. Then I'll use my move tool to move her over here. Now, obviously that doesn't work from a size standpoint, so I need to change her to be a little bit smaller. I'll go to Edit and then Free Transform, and we'll shrink her down so that she's about the right height. So you have to have a little bit of a sense for how tall your building is and how big this figure should be. You know, that's too big for the scale of my building. That's probably getting pretty close. To the right scale, maybe something about like that. So if I press Control 0 now and I zoom out, we can see that I have the silhouette. The silhouette kind of blends into the background a little bit. So I might change it to match what the ground would be. So I might change it to be black, or I might change it to be white. Really easy to do, and that's why I have you guys make this a 75% gray, because all we have to do is add an adjustment layer to the woman walking. I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. It's going to be a Levels adjustment. I'll press Control-Alt-G to tie it just to the silhouette. And then I can adjust using these sliders whether I want her to be black, or excuse me, white, or using the white slider I can pull her to be black. Looks like the black really doesn't show up at all. So in this case, it might even be better to lighten her up and make her white so that she's pretty obvious as to what the scale of the building would be. So I can use the exact same strategy on the ground as well. So if I decided that I didn't like the ground being black anymore, I could change the ground to be white. So I could go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. I could go to my Levels adjustment, Control-Alt-G to tie it to the ground layer. And then the same thing here. I could pull the ground and make the ground white, which is a little bit different take. So again, it's dependent on the look for what you're after as to whether you want it to be black or you want it to be white. Oops. Sorry, I moved the wrong one. There we go. There it is in black. So you got that flexibility to change it afterward. So on this, as I continue to fine tune it a little bit, if I were to put this on a drawing and print it on an actual presentation, this would have a very sharp top. So it would have a distinct, like, this is the end of the drawing, which to some people would be just fine. It's clipping it right there. Sometimes you want the background to just kind of fade away into nothing. And so we could do that same fade by going and working with our mask a little bit more. So if we come down here into the background image, we already have a mask on this image. Remember to cut out for the building. But I can change that mask such that it goes from white all the way up to black and kind of a fade at the top. So let me create a selection. And this rectangular selection, I want to start that selection at wherever I want it to be completely solid. So this would be completely solid, and I want it to fade going up to here. And so as I create that fade, I'll do it with the gradient tool. So there's gradient tool. I need to make sure that my two colors are black and white. My foreground and my background color are black and white. I need to make sure that I'm on the mask itself. And then I can draw a line with that gradient tool that's going to control how that fades away into nothing. So in that scenario, it's fading away. Don't be worried so much about that line. That's just, we're seeing through to some of the background. But if I didn't want it to fade quite so long, I could change the fade to be shorter. I could change it to be really short, depending on how quickly I want that fade to happen. Does that kind of make sense? I'm just adjusting the top end of that mask. So maybe it's about like that, and that feels about right. If I do it too far down here, I lose an awful lot of the mountains going up. So really, I think a shorter fade toward the top is probably the best strategy, because I'm just fading out the very tips of the mountains, and I'm still getting what the view would be. So now I have that. I could change the image, the background image, to be in black and white, or even to a sepia tone. Same strategy here. I would just go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Remember, we did it with the channel mixer when we converted to black and white. So I could go to channel mixer, Control-Alt-G to tie the channel mixer layer to the background. There we go. There we go. And then on the channel mixer, there we go. I'm going to click on monochrome, and then I would go through what my various presets would be, picking one that I like the most. This one turned out okay, but you could again go through what the right look was to create that kind of black and white. Sometimes this is a good strategy because you're making the background become less important, and you're kind of highlighting your building, you're drawing attention to it because your building is the part that's in color. So again, these are all different strategies for kind of how do you make your elevation look good. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys start working. I know it's a lot to kind of take in and all the various steps. I will post the lecture for today. If you go on the course website, under tutorials, we're into the assemblies, which are down toward the bottom here. I have SketchUp to Photoshop elevations. Unfortunately, I don't have it all written out. I just have a link to one of the videos so you can watch me do it. Under some of the other ones, like the sections, for example, I actually have it written out step by step as you work your way through with lots of images and that sort of thing. So I apologize it's not completely written out, but I think you guys can get the bulk out of it from the video. Okay? Are there any questions? No? All right, I'll let you guys start working.